what I really want to focus on right now as a parent is to understand a little more deeply about how the curriculum and the educational experience is working. So I understand what's going on with my daughter and can support the school, but also for the purpose of talking with prospective families, because we know that one of the first ways that prospective families come to meet a school or to learn about a school is to talk to current parents. And when people talk to me, I want to have something intelligent to say. You know, I want to be able to explain what we're doing and why it is different from our traditional educational system. So I'm going to talk about the 4 characteristics of a classical education. These are characteristics that are listed on our website. You'll see it in our materials there. And what I want to do is I want to use the classical tradition a bit to sort of unfold what these characteristics are and tell you a little bit about what it means, why they're significant, and what they look like in our day-to-day work with our kids. So there are 4 of them. The first is the natural stages of learning. And the natural stages of learning, that's the idea that every kid is hardwired at different ages of their life to have particular skills, particular strengths, and ways of learning. And so what the classical curriculum does is that it maps onto the child's natural development and what they do well, and they use that as pedagogical tools and ways to teach. And also, it helps us understand how we're going to sort of form and present the information that we teach. So the second one is the focus on language. Now, of course, our children are learning foreign languages, and that's a part of their curriculum. But this goes a little step further, too, to talk about how the process of what it means to learn a language is a process that turns our kids into thinkers, into broader thinkers. The third one is history as an organizing principle. What does it mean to say that history is an organizing principle? So our curriculum is set up in such a way that the kids go through cycles year by year. They look at big historical periods. And over a period of years, they get a large picture of human history and civilization. And as they learn disciplines and as they learn new ideas, they see, because it's part of that history, the breadth and depth of that. So for example, you could learn all sorts of interesting things and factoids about Galileo, and that might be interesting to you. But that would be a very different thing from learning about Galileo when you were immersed in the Renaissance. That opens up all kinds of new questions, because then you could think about, how did he change the way we think about ourselves in the world? Why was it so controversial? Why were people so mad at him? And understanding all of those sorts of events and that information as a plot point in a bigger human story draws all of our knowledge together, which brings us to the last big principle: developing thought and unity of knowledge. And what this means is that all disciplines, all academic subjects, and all knowledge are connected together through our exploration and our journey toward what is good and beautiful and true. All of those subjects address the same sort of fundamental questions that we all live with. Questions about who we are, our purpose, the creation we live in, and our Creator. So I'm going to talk a little bit and show you a little bit about what these characteristics look like and what classical philosophy has to say about them. So first of all, the natural stages of learning. How is it that children are wired to learn? So Plato tells us in the Republic that the capacity, the power of learning exists in the soul already. This is really important in the classical tradition. Children are made to learn. We don't have to do anything to prepare them to learn. We can't actually prevent them from learning either. They are made for the purpose of developing their mind, their body, and their spirit. It's an important principle. And so how do we approach that? We approach that by being aware of what Aristotle reminds us. The poets who divide ages by sevens are in the main right, but we should observe the divisions actually made by nature. Birth through 7, 7 through 14, 14 in the next 7 years. Each of those eras of our moment in our lives and our development has with it different sorts of skills and different things that we can do. And so what we do is that we have pedagogical tools that target kids where they are. This is why, and you'll see, imitation is an important skill for younger kids. We know this is true, right? Kids are mimics. That's what they do. And that is how they learn things. They imitate and they mimic what they learn. They repeat it over and over and over again, which is why, toddler jokes, you can do it 100 times and it still is funny every single time to them. Because that sort of repetition, the mimicry, the imitation, is part of how they're learning and solidifying information. So that's an example of how being aware of that is shaping what's happening in the classroom and how our teachers are working with our kids. Now, once we have a sense of how children are learning, then we're ready to think about how do we map what they need to learn on top of that. Here, St. Victor describes the subjects of the classical curriculum in this way. The ancients in their studies especially selected 7 to be mastered by those who were to be educated. These are called by the name trivium and quadrivium because by them a quick mind enters into the secret places of wisdom. Okay, that's a lot. So the trivium, what is the trivium? The trivium is what our children are doing right now. It is grammar, logic, and rhetoric. Grammar, when we begin to learn what letters are and how they form themselves into words. Logic, when we begin to think about how those sentences combine with each other and how we use all of those grammatical pieces and parts into something new and make something out of it. And then the rhetorical stage, where students are invited to think about what does it mean that we put things together and arrange them in this way? What kind of meaning can we create about that, from that? What's the significance of that kind of information? It's set up in such a way that students move forward in terms of complexity over time to when they get to the quadrivium. The quadrivium includes the mathematical arts, things like arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and so forth. And so once we understand how a child learns and when they're ready to learn certain subjects, then we take those academic subjects and present them in that way to them. So they hit them at the right stage at the right time. And here's another thing that's important to remember about the natural stages of learning, and something that I think is really important about the classical education. Rousseau tells us that we should love childhood, indulge its sports, its pleasures, its delightful instincts, treat your scholar according to his age. Play and fun is an important part of the classical curriculum and that kind of exploration because we are building a child together as a school, as parents, and as a community who are developed in mind, in spirit, and in body. And so Plato and Aristotle thought that kids needed to learn actually 3 things. There are 3 subjects that they thought all kids should learn. They should learn reading, they should learn music, and they should have gymnastics. That's what they should do. And why gymnastics? I mean, we know reading. We know about all the good stuff about reading and why we need to read to our kids and why we need to get our kids to read. We know that. We understand the way that music can kind of unfold a lot about mathematical knowledge and introduce our kids to what is true and beautiful and good. But why is gymnastics so important here? So we know, of course, I mean, it's not just about getting the wiggles out, so the kids can focus on what they really need to focus on. And it's not simply also about having a healthy body, even though those 2 things are important and good byproducts of that. The other reason why the classical tradition encourages us in gymnastic instruction is because it's seen as a form of moral formation. That there are moral things that children learn through the task of learning a sport or learning a new skill or strategy. They learn discipline. They learn self-control. They learn all of those wonderful lessons that kids learn when they come across a challenge and then they have to figure out all by themselves how to meet that challenge, how to solve their problem, and how to move forward. So that is a way in which The classical education model is in some ways different from what we see traditionally. When we see the way that the traditional school system talks about the training of the body, it's quite different from the way that we think about the whole child. The next major characteristic is focus on language. What does that mean? Hugh St. Victor says, order in the disciplines is arranged to follow nature. In the exposition of the text, the order followed is adapted to inquiry. Exposition includes three things: the letter, the sense, and the inner meaning. What is he talking about here? What he's talking about is not only the process of learning a language and the pieces and parts that you go through, but what he's also explaining here is that learning a language is a mode of thinking as well. And this is why it's so important in the classical system. We begin by learning the sort of simple phonemes and the pieces and parts that make up words and that vocabulary. Then we begin to construct that vocabulary and do interesting things with it and try to make sentences. And then we move on to more complex literature and begin to think about, the interpretation of it and what is the meaning of it. And the way in which those knowledges build up on top of each other is a mode of learning that we see replicated in many ways across the curriculum. Simple, basic elements that are built with more and more complexity as they go along and as they age. Now, of course, in addition to language, this involves reading as well. And this is, of course, a big hallmark of the classical system, what we give our kids to read. Rousseau says that there is, moreover, a certain simplicity of taste which goes straight to the heart, and that is found only in the classics. Why do we have such a focus on classical texts and classical literature and poetry, as you're going to see our kids do? Why do we emphasize that? Because we know that it is reading that orients the child toward the good, the beautiful, and the true. That there is great wisdom and depth of knowledge that is there and lessons that they can learn in this literature. And along with that, there's also the principle of imitation that St. Augustine talks about in On Christian Doctrine. Why give your children the best literature? If a man desire to speak not only with wisdom, but with eloquence also, and assuredly he will prove of greater service if he can do both, I would rather send him to read and listen to and exercise himself in imitating eloquent men. When we imitate great men and great women who show us what is good and beautiful and true, it shapes the soul to crave the good and beautiful and true. And so what it does is that it predisposes the child to look for certain ways for spiritual food. There's a lot to read and see out there that's entertaining. There's a lot of stuff that's fun. But when children are raised up and when they grow and learn reading literature like this and encountering human knowledge in this way, they will return to it time and time again as the place where you get good spiritual food, where your soul is fed by good ideas. That we can enjoy other forms of literature or other films or movies or TV that we see, but this is always what we come back to because our tastes are shaped to turn to the good and the beautiful and the true. History is an organizing principle. There are a couple of ways in which the classical model approaches history as an organizing principle. Certainly, our students are getting a really broad view of human history, from ancient times, all through modern history, through American history. And that's important. We certainly want that. We want students to be able to contextualize what they learn and understand how every new discovery and everything we learn is part of the larger human story. But there are other things that we get out of it too. And this is part of what C.S. Lewis tells us about in learning in wartime. Why is history so important? A man who has lived in many places is not likely to be deceived by the local errors of his native village. The scholar has lived in many times and is therefore in some degree immune from the great cataract of nonsense that pours from the press and the microphone of his own age. This, I know, isn't it wonderful? This is part of what's important, because certainly while we are forming the whole child, part of what we want to do is we want to prepare them for the world that they are about to inherit. We want to equip them well for that. And part of that equipage is to be able to understand ourselves and our moment and where we stand in human history as part of a larger story. It is true what the writer of Ecclesiastes says, that there is nothing new under the sun. Every challenge that we face, every major problem that humans face, it has come back around. We answer the same questions over and over in new ages and in new times. And when you have a larger sense of history, it gives you sort of a sense of a comfort and a knowledge that we may be standing here by right now, but our sisters and our brothers have stood there before us. This is how they have answered this challenge. It's not something new. It may have its own particular flavor of the moment, but it is part of what we are equipped to do and part of what we are ready to do. So it helps children to see themselves and locate themselves in terms of human history. And I could go on and on about why, from my perspective as somebody at the university, this is really important and students need more of this, but I won't. But human history and how we locate ourselves in human history is an important part of the story, but there's another one as well. And that is, of course, our place in salvation history. Pope Benedict XVI, in his address to Catholic educators, said that education is integral to the mission of the Church to proclaim the good news. First and foremost, every Catholic educational institution is a place to encounter the living God, who in Jesus Christ reveals his transforming love and truth. This is the other history that we anchor our students within in the classical tradition. To understand themselves as part of the revelation that continues to unfold and as part of the story of salvation, that we all have place within that. So finally, developing thought and unity of knowledge. Why is this an important principle and characteristic of education, and why is it different? Pope John Paul II said that driven by the desire to discover the ultimate truth of existence, human beings seek to acquire those universal elements of knowledge which enable them to understand themselves better. These fundamental elements of knowledge spring from the wonder awakened in them by the contemplation of creation. All subjects and all university disciplines are tied together because each one of them has formed out of an attempt to answer some really fundamental questions. Who are we? What is this creation? And who is our creator? We answer that way through thinking about natural phenomena. We answer that way through thinking about the material world. We answer that way through the study of religion. And often those different subjects are presented to students as being their own individual little boxes, right? You have a book for this, and now we go to this class and we do this, and we go to this class and do this, which doesn't allow for the student to understand that there is a connective tissue between all of that. And the connective tissue that draws all of those disciplines together and unifies all that knowledge is our search for God and our search for what is eternal. And the classical education system is designed to keep students mindful that this is what all human knowledge is about. Our human knowledge is about that search for God. And that each of our disciplines has its own answer for that, its own way of exploring and understanding those questions. So, wonder and understanding the connection between disciplines and the unity of disciplines is important, but it also is a form of thinking as well. In his essay, Wonder, Abraham Joshua Heschel says that wonder or radical amazement is the chief characteristic of the religious man's attitude toward history and nature. To find an approximate cause of a phenomenon is no answer to his ultimate wonder. To the prophets, wonder is a form of thinking. There's no answer in the world to man's radical amazement. This is how classical tradition develops thinkers. We encourage students to be creative and inquisitive, not because that will lead them to an answer that is the end of the story. It's because it leads them to other questions and new questions. And we understand what wonder means primarily through this sort of exploration. And here's the final thought that I'm going to leave you with. I want to talk to you a little bit more here about wonder and what it is. This is the motto of our school here. Let them be born in wonder. The insights of wonder must be constantly kept alive. Since there is a need for daily wonder, there is also a need for daily worship. The sense that miracles which are daily with us, the sense of the continual marvels, is the source of prayer. Wonder is the attitude of never taking anything for granted. Wonder is the attitude of always being surprised at the continual renewal of the creation, of the way that we develop routines. I mean, Heschel even talks about, like, we should be amazed by the fact that we even have a routine to thank God for our food. That should invoke wonder in us as well. And we understand wonder, I think very much through our journey as Christians, because we embark on a journey and a walk with God that takes over our entire lives, and we're never done. We start as children and we come up with new questions and we learn new things, which opens up new doors and new ways of becoming closer to God. And we go through all these doors and we continue to journey. And we journey knowing that we are never going to know the answer in this life. We undertake that journey knowing we are never going to fully know and understand God until we see Him face to face. That is when everything will be revealed. But until then, we continue to ask questions. And this is what I think is key about the classical Catholic curriculum. It invites students to take what we already understand about our Christian walk and to see all of human knowledge as being much the same, that all of creation is singing the same song. Not only our faith, but everything that we have learned, all of it is geared toward understanding and drawing ourselves closer and orienting ourselves to what is beautiful and true and good, which is God. And thank you very much.